3, 2, 1. Anthony Darby.
Chuck Henn.
The first of our public released podcasts for your entertainment. For those folks unfamiliar with who the heck we are, my name is Anthony Darby. I'm the CEO of Peninsula Alternative Health, also the CEO of Peninsula Holistics. Peninsula Alternative Health is our medical cannabis dispensary here in Salisbury, Maryland. Been in operation now for a little over a year and a half. We started our company about 3.5 years ago.
August of 2015, I believe, is what our corporation papers say.
And a little over a year and a half ago, we founded Peninsula Holistics, which is our hemp-based wellness cannabinoid company. These are all words that you guys will be more familiar with as you listen to why we say what they are. But Peninsula Holistics only focuses on cannabinoid products that come from industrial hemp and hemp products. The state of Maryland, because of the way that we are regulated, doesn't allow us to sell any products other than we're part of the Maryland system within our dispensary. We had this need for folks that were looking for CBD and other cannabinoid products that were able to be derived from hemp and able to be consumed without having a Maryland cannabis card. So we ended up forming these two entities, and through these explorations and forming these businesses, we've had an amazing amount of experiences and stories and knowledge that we've gained that a lot of folks have come to us and said that they love to hear this, and we should do this type of a forum of a podcast, and this is kind of our crack at it. So how you doing, Chuck?
I'm good, man. It's good to be live. I think we've been toying around with this for a while. I think we all believe that this will be a great outlet, a way for us to share what we've learned, as Darby was kind of alluding to, and also give us a chance to expand on what we know too, as more people are participating in the conversations going forward. So it's going to be a collaborative. It's not just going
to be us. We're going to have lots of guests on. We're going to be hopefully bring some of the top performers in the cannabis industry right to you guys, some of the top performers in the hemp industry right to you guys, and really making this really an educational forum, and not just engaging, but entertaining as well. So
I think we can be the conduit, for lack of a better word, between a lot of this stuff, whether it be hemp and cannabis, different people in the industry like Darby was talking about. I think it's going to be a super cool thing.
Set the background a little bit. So for those folks that are not familiar with me, I started in sales and business development back in 2005, held a variety of different roles, selling software, selling products for American Express, a lot of different opportunities that gave me a really good insight to be able to see, who are some of the top performing small businesses and who are some of the top performing mid-sized businesses, and what are these guys doing that makes them so successful, and even had a little bit of experience in the franchise world and got to see what makes a concept be able to explode at a level where you can go from 200 locations to 1,000 locations. So my background is really on that entrepreneurial business development side, and I'd always been a cannabis user since really early college days. I didn't really use cannabis a lot in high school. I was really a heavy drinker, to be completely honest. And it was then through college when I met some friends, like most of us, was introduced to cannabis. And then after college, really altered the way that I used cannabis into more of like a medical value, and to the point that, everyone kind of called it my medicine, even when it was still this illegal drug. So I've always had this tie to cannabis and this love for growing a business. So when the opportunity came to start a dispensary, although it definitely wasn't the first thing that we chose, when we finally did get our minds around that concept, I felt like my background led me to be in a good position to take a CEO role, and to do that successfully, I needed to have some really amazing partners. And my partners in both businesses are Chuck Henn, who is our role as our COO, and he'll kind of run through a little bit about his background in a second. We also have Dan Corpon as our Chief Technology Officer. He's got background in both finance and hospital background on the technology and finance side of those institutions. He's done a lot within the last 6 months within our business of really making us scalable and cleaning things up. And then everyone who's familiar with us has got to be familiar with Dr. Hoffman. Dr. Mary Pat Hoffman, PharmD, is our trusted clinical director. She has led us down the medical side, the clinical side of this path, and really gave us a level up on what we feel the competition in not only the state, but even at a national level, speaking on a national stage at the Cannabis Science Conference. So we have a pretty well-rounded team, you know, a PharmD, a nerd, a cocky sales guy, myself, and then Chuck is really the concrete and is our chief operations officer. Chuck, give him a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so thanks for the introduction there, Darbs. My background is pretty diverse, I would say. Like Darby and Corpon, the three of us all graduated from Salisbury University right here in Salisbury, Maryland. After that, I moved back to Baltimore, and I worked in finance for 3 years, from 2007 to 2010. So, I mean, that experience was great because it was the height of the financial crisis. I got to see a lot of things that kind of took everything down. We were in charge of financial reporting for a bunch of mutual funds and stuff, and all those mutual funds held the credit default swaps. So it was it was a tough time for the nation, but it was an interesting time to learn about economics and kind of how things work. After that, I got bored of sitting in a cubicle. If anybody knows me, they know that's not my steez in life. So I left and I got into an electrical apprenticeship in Washington, D.C. It was a 5-year apprenticeship program doing commercial and industrial electric work on large projects in and around D.C. I did that for 8 years. By the end, I was a foreman, I guess, for the last 4. So I had the opportunity to run a lot of cool jobs, a lot of historic jobs in D.C.
Deal with a lot of regulators?
Oh, yeah. Deal with a lot of regulation. If anybody is in construction, especially this day and age, construction's way different than it was back in the day. You know how OSHA, a lot of the general contractors, through insurance companies mandate a lot of regulation. So a large portion of my day as a foreman and as a supervisor were spent overseeing regulation.
It changes so much from your day-to-day.
Yeah, I feel like I never left. I just don't get up as early. So that kind of background in managing these large projects, managing a large, diverse group of people, and dealing with the regulations, and just from the inspection point, because we deal with that all the time through the MMCC. We deal with that all the time in construction. Those kind of things allow me to do my job today for both Peninsula Alternative Health and Peninsula Holistics.
A lot of times when we are looking at new business opportunities or even just really the direction of how we run our organizations and our businesses, I seem to be more the conduit of ideas and saying, hey, can we do this? And what happens if we do this? And I feel really strongly we could do this, but I'd feel even more strongly if someone could give me some numbers to back it up. You know, typically I can go to Chuck and say, can you fortify this idea for me, or can you substantiate my hypothesis that if we do X, Y, and Z, we'll do this. And you got to understand, for those folks that are really unfamiliar with the markets that we operate in. I mean, when we say emerging markets, we operate in some of the most tumultuous of waters. The changes on the absolute daily. Something that was legal yesterday is no longer legal today. Something that was completely banned yesterday is now endorsed today. It's and then a lot of gray area. We painfully just went through our IRS tax process, and like, the truth be told, there's no case law to substantiate anything. I mean, you really have to be the dictators of what happens here. So a lot of the things that we do, whether we like it or not, is really setting precedent for those that come behind us. How we file our taxes, how we participate, how we follow the MMC regulations, all these different things that are up for interpretation. At the level that we are at in this stage of the market, we are really dictating and influencing what others are doing, and we see it immediately, and especially in our dispensaries. That's one of the greatest things, compliments that I see is we go and we change something or we do something, and then you see the ripple effect of 5 people follow and emulate or copy the exact same thing, and you know that it was a good idea because other people are trying to do it and it's working. So I wanted to at least provide some foundational background of kind of who you hear behind these microphones and who's talking. We're going to talk about hemp. We're going to talk about cannabis. We're going to talk about laws. We're going to have cool people in. I hope to bring in a variety of folks to talk about a variety of different topics to keep this engaging and appealing to folks that may not care about cannabis as much as they care about the agricultural side of hemp and spot pricing of future hemp products, to those folks that are not so much interested in hemp but would love to know more about the future of the concentrate market here in the United States and things like that. So we'll try to be really in the details of these different areas in a broad way so that from someone on the street, you're able to get an inside purview and perspective that is really tough for you to get anywhere else. I feel like a great way to start with that kind of insider look is to do a 2019 legislative wrap-up. So Chuck alluded to the fact that we've been playing Make Pretend podcast now for almost 2 months now, I think.
Yeah. I think we have 6 episodes so far, I believe.
And roughly the beginning of the legislative session was when we started. And we did probably 3 different runs of this because we did one in the very beginning. We did one that we had an update, and now we have one now. And it's changed tremendously. And we're talking to lobbyists. We're talking to guys that are completely in the know. But it's just amazing how these bills flow through, what gets passed, what doesn't get passed. Some of the things that we thought we wouldn't see the light of day came out quicker than others. And if we're going to talk about the laws, I think it's important to at least understand the purview of what the Maryland legislature looks like, because I understand that not everyone here is from Maryland. So, like most state legislators, most of our elected officials, this is not their full-time job. Almost all of them are going to carry a regular full-time job. They are volunteers. And the 2 largest issues that were facing them when they came to Annapolis today, among a multitude, were a education bill that was based upon a 4-year study, is what I believe, done by the Kerwin Commission, with a lot of recommendations to what Maryland can do to fix their schools. This is something, especially for the Eastern Shore delegation, that is really at hand, because when the school ratings came out, our schools ranked really poor. And as they're trying to attract more talent and more young folks and business owners and things like that, with housing prices just incredibly affordable and a great place to live, the one area that folks struggle to deal with is the school systems. And I think Chuck Henn is one of them. I have 2 partners in this business that I would absolutely love to convince to move down here, but until these schools get fixed in a major way, it's not even on the table. And I think that's probably a lot of business owners that are in the same pace. I heard from the president of Purdue that one of their new senior ranking officials is flying on a jet every Monday morning, flying home on Thursday. She's not moving her kids to Salisbury until there's a school that meets her criteria. So schools were a big one for these guys, and then the other one's going to be minimum wage increases, which a lot of states are addressing. Once again, that's really effective on the Eastern Shore because we have seasonal workers. We have
a lot of restaurants.
Yeah, we have folks that come in on visas just for the summertime that work in the restaurants. You have a lot of farm workers. You have a lot of lower average cost of living towns where a minimum wage is not as justified there as it is in somewhere like Montgomery County. So just to give you an idea, these guys have a lot, and gals have a lot of issues that they're dealing with, and cannabis typically is not something that they're very versed on. It's not typically something that they know a lot about, but recently we've seen a lot of cannabis legislation be thrown at them.
Yeah, I mean, and just to put it into context, I think the first time that we looked at all the bills that were being introduced into the session, it was maybe the beginning of February, call it. And I think there were 19 by the time legislation was finished. the first week of April, right? I think there were 45 total bills that were introduced on top of everything else that they're trying to solve in the state
Just
of
on
Maryland.
cannabis.
Just on cannabis. And
That's not gun right. That's not education. That's not crime. That's not immigration.
And a lot of the bills that we look at it through a different set of eyes, right? Because we're in the industry, we're business owners here, we're patients here. We see the effects that it has. Like if you look at some of the legislation that was introduced, it's easy to see why it would be super beneficial or super hurtful to the industry. But if a legislator's looking at it, they're reading the headline on it, and when they're looking at it, in their mind, it doesn't mean anything. It's just one of those things they have to vote on. They don't have the context behind it. And that's why, and we've alluded to this in the past, like it's super important that we get in the ears of these people, do stuff like this, try to bring light of some of these issues and how it really does have its effect.
So the way this is going to roll is we're going to run through a couple of the major issues / bills that came through and actually had traction enough to get some discussion and debate on. The very last one we're going to end on is probably the question that I get asked more than anything else at this point in time, is when is legalization coming, either at a federal or state level? So we'll try to dive into that a little bit. So for the first bill that got a lot of attention in the state of Maryland was the ownership and licensing bill. This was introduced by Senator Chris West out of Baltimore County, and it was originally 6.
It was originally 6 was the proposal at first, yes.
And the bill that passed scaled it down to 4. And this limits how many licenses a license holder can hold of any one of the 3 verticals, either grow, process, or dispensary. So the original...
Really just dispensary for this one.
I'm sorry, yep. You're right, just dispensary. This was brought up because the original bill allotted for 1 licensee per vertical, so you can only own 1 dispensary. Like everything else, a bunch of fancy attorneys went through and realized they missed some T's and didn't dot the I's, right? And have the word applicant instead of licensee, and didn't account for what happens if a management company owns 99.1% of the business and the 1% is still actually owned by the original applicant. And what we see is the outcome of what I'm trying to get to is there's several different Rise dispensaries in Maryland. There's several different Zen Leafs in Maryland. And now Harvest and Zen Leaf are together, and you put them together, and now you have more dispensaries that fit on one hand than you do, under one roof. And I think for a lot of small business owners that got into this dispensary stuff, this is really alarming. But what was funny for me was to see how some of them flip-flopped on the bill based upon what they perceive their own interest to be. So when it comes out with 6, everyone's against it, and they're willing to go on the news, and everyone's willing to make a big stink and say there's no possible way that this could be the reality, right? And then they started saying, well, what happens if we don't put this bill in place? What's stopping these management agreements from having 10 locations or 20 locations or really the wild, wild west taking place with no regulation and everyone just acquiring companies up as they want? And fear is always a great driver of all this stuff. So at this meantime, we're hearing rumors of the Canadian companies are coming. The Canadian companies are coming, right?
It's just like the revolution, right?
Yeah,
Like
the redcoats are coming. Yeah, the redcoats are coming. So, we see folks that were originally super against this bill saying, no, we have to pass this because at least it caps it at 4, and 4 is horrible and not great, but it's better than 10 or 20, right? And I think that's where we fell somewhere in, at least myself thought, I won't lump chunk into my answers with this, but for myself, I realized that something had to be done one way or another. They couldn't just leave it the way that it was, because there was just so much ambiguity, and I thought they had to clean it up. And I didn't think that they had the legal wherewithal to go in and actually enforce what they wanted to, which was to get it back down to 1. I have faith that the great attorneys and folks at Verano and GTI were more than happy and willing to have that battle with our good friends at MMCC. And unfortunately, I just don't know that they have the firepower that those guys have, and I think it would have just gotten tied up. So I think that at the end of the day, although it's it's a little alarming because as someone who planned to only have one dispensary, who had felt that we could only have one dispensary over the first 18 months and have been in different situations to act differently through our behavior. If we would have known this law, I could be a little sour grapes, but at the same time, I just think it's a little bit of the evolution of Maryland, and I think it's a good bill. Charles?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with very much of what Darby said. I think, at least for me, there's a lot of, it's more than what it seems on the surface, just like anything, right? I mean, right now, when there were 102 pre-approval stage 1 licenses in the state of Maryland, and they were all supposed to be operational within 12 months of getting that pre-approval. Well, it turns out 4 of us were actually operational out of 102. So there are a lot of factors at play. A lot of the dispensaries have gotten tied up in local issues, whether the majority of them require like zoning. So it's a simple way for local municipalities who don't necessarily want this in their backyard to kind of zone companies out of there. And it's not a fair practice. And it's created a lot of ambiguity. And as of now, there's only, I think there's 78 licensed dispensaries as opposed to 102. So for me, you have a lot of these dispensaries that are still struggling because they had a horrible time getting open, much of it not their fault. And they could use some help. And at the same time, patients in Maryland are without 22 dispensaries, which are local to a lot of these places. And a lot of these dispensaries are probably going to be located in the more rural areas, places that, patients could drive 10 minutes down the road as opposed to 30 to go somewhere. And I think it kind of hurts the patients by not having the dispensaries open. So I think 4 is a perfectly fine number. I think it allows the good operators to get into the industry and operate efficiently and provide the patients the medicine that they need. So overall, I'm glad they did something about it because, like Darby said as well, if you just left the management agreements in place, it would have been the Wild West. Like, there's no doubt about it. It just would have been everything that the state didn't want to happen. You would have had a few companies controlling the majority of the market. And I think at least if you put this in place, there's going to be some more competition out there.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen. So for those folks that aren't familiar, Maryland's market is one of the best markets from both patient and from an investor standpoint in the nation. And that's why you have companies like Harvest and Verano and GTI and all these large players coming in because it's such a robust program. And I just think that, for us to continue down that path, making sure capping it at 4, I think it lets those guys still have a play, so we're still getting these larger players and good quality competition. And for us, we'll just have to see kind of how it shapes through, and hope that the independents like us, stay competitive and don't feel a need to. I think what you'll see is if the larger guys come in and all of a sudden this becomes a burden, you'll see independent pharmacy groups or independent dispensary groups form just like you would an Epic pharmacy group or buyers or things like that. So for us, not a big fear. I think it at least cleans some things up. It also subjects both the dispensaries, growers, and processors to the Antitrust Act and Maryland Sales Below Cost Act, which I don't know a ton of, but I just assume those are consumer protection laws that are put in place to make sure that none of these monopolies come in and really start affecting our patients.
And the one thing that it didn't change, it was just for dispensaries. So it didn't change anything on the grower or the processor side. You're still only allowed to have an interest in one single grower and one single processor, and now up to 4 dispensaries.
And with the acquisition of Harvest acquiring Verano, it'll be interesting to see exactly what that means. My assumption is that they'll still operate. Well, what we've been told is they're going to operate as 2 completely separate entities in the state of Maryland, but we know that everything at the end of the day is still being funneled up to one company as they are owned by the same entity. So it'll be interesting to see how Maryland deciphers that, or if they even try to address at that level what happens. These guys, it's tough. Every time they create a law, every time they try to do something, there's 10 people out there that are trying to figure out how to either get around it or try to to mess with these folks. So it is interesting.
They got a difficult job.
One of the things is we're exploring other options for locations, where you have to stay within Senate District 37. It's this arbitrary guideline that's around Dorchester, Talbot, and Wycomico County. But the thing about it is, and it's going to stay for us, but they're getting ready to do redistricting. They're getting ready to change that arbitrary guideline. Now, it doesn't change our predicament, but it's just always interesting at how much our lives are affected by what may seem as the smallest little nuances, like a redistricting of a Senate district. On to the next bill. This was, we were doing our prep, Chuck kind of mentioned, this was really a catch-all bill. It was entitled the Use Advertising and Immunity Bill. And it went through and did a couple different things that I'll run through, and then Chuck, give me your feedback on what you think about some of them, and then I'll chime in. First thing it does is it authorizes institutions of higher education and medical facilities to register with the commission to purchase medical cannabis for research purposes. This is really great. I don't know that we'll see anyone act on that because these universities still have such federal ties, but even in the idea of the message of it, I think it's good.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think anything we can do to further the research in this, especially to put it in kind of that institutional research place, is a good idea.
The bill requires the commission to allow licensed dispensaries to sell edible cannabis products. It increases the length of time medical cannabis license holder must be actively engaged in the industry before selling or transferring ownership of a license from 2 years or 3 years. It expands legal protection for individuals participating in the state's medical cannabis program, and it also regulates medical cannabis advertising. It says it does a lot of those things, but in some ways it just basically touches on some of them more than it really regulates hard. Do you want to go through in some of the changes or outcomes you think?
Yeah, so I guess the biggest one that everybody, that maybe the second biggest question besides when's the adult use legalization coming is the edible program. It's something that is super popular out west. It's something that everybody knows about, and it's also one of the most controversial things, only because of the dosing. It's really hard to get those doses right. And, when people ask us about it, that's still the catch-all. But I really do think that Maryland, with the testing requirements we have in place and the growers and the processors that are here in the state, I think they understand how to do it properly, how to regulate it, and how to dose it. And at the same time, I also think it's a great solution to some of our patients who could use that. I mean, edibles are a game changer for a lot of people, and it's something that we get a lot of questions about, and we're happy to hopefully be able to provide this sometime at the end of the year.
I think the real talk, and this is, it's tough to say, but truthfully, I'm kind of glad the edibles didn't roll out in the very beginning, because I do believe that it creates an additional set of risks and variables that we don't face with most of the products that we have in our dispensary. But overwhelmingly, it's got to be the number one demand that we hear. And when you guys get edibles, And to Chuck's point, there's a lot of patients that it truly is the best method of administration for them. And more than anything else, it's what they want. When you look at these consumer studies, although cookies and brownies are non-traditional forms of medication, cannabis is a non-traditional medication, and people like the idea that they get to dose in a brownie. And if they're feeling bad and a brownie that's sweet, that brings them joy with some THC in it, is able to regulate their body and allow them to get the best night's sleep they ever had, then we should be empowering patients to do that. So I'm willing to muster the additional risk and liabilities in the favor of, I think it's time that patients now have this option of edibles. And at this point, we've seen the line pushed. I mean, we have troches in our dispensary. I'm sure you guys are very familiar with troches. If you're not, it's a word that I learned 9 months ago that an attorney came up with, the name of gummy, so that it's legal. A troche is a soft lozenger. A gummy is an illegal treat that's not allowed in Maryland. So we don't sell gummies. We have, or even artisanal gummies, which you may see advertised in other states that look exactly like the gummies that we have, or troches in our dispensary. But we're starting to see these guys, Betty's, Eddie's. There's several products in our dispensary right now that are very much pushing the envelope of edibles, and to their point, to Chuck's point, they've done it in a very good way. These products, although they are pushing the edible guidelines, the dosing of them, the directions on them, they're very reasonable. They're not crazy high doses. as great as California is for blazing the trail in Washington State and even Colorado, some of the deregulation that those programs enjoy has created some fear that I think our program doesn't necessarily have. And like, no one thinks that Tony or Anthony Darby and Chuck Henn are pro-regulation. We're not. We're not guys that love this type of oversight, but it's needed. Cannabis is certainly nowhere near the reefer madness drug that people make it out to be. But if left completely unregulated, there's going to be a lot of more negative stories. And some of these things that cannabis has never hurt anybody or anything like that. Well, if you just flood the market with it and make it so that it's easy for a 9-year-old to get a 100 milligram cookie, they're going to start seeing more and more bad stories. 9-year-old going to die? No, he's not. Thank God. Yeah. Because we know there's a story in Maryland of a young child who died of getting her stepmother's fentanyl. So no, the kid's not going to die. But is that what we want to start exposing our kids to? Is that the kind of stories we want to get out there? Absolutely not.
I think on Darby's point about the kids, and that's another thing. I think a lot of the lawmakers see it too, is the pushback of like, okay, now you're selling cookies with THC in it. If a kid's going to start anywhere, that's where they're going to start. And fortunately in Maryland, even if we're producing edibles, there's going to be, I am sure, I don't know for a fact, but I'm sure there's going to be an entire set of regulation about how it's packaged, how it's labeled, what you can have on the label, no cartoons, same thing we deal with in the products that we sell now at the dispensary. I think they're going to do a really good job at regulating it to try to keep a lot of that stuff from happening. They're all going to have to be in child-resistant packages still.
You're not going to see them mimicking the Skittles bag or them mimicking like some of the consumer products that kids would be familiar with that we see in other states. Maryland's been really great about that. I can assume they're going to continue down that guideline. And here's the truth. So edibles are coming to Maryland. Out of the commissioner's and executive director's mouth, she'd like to have them by the end of this calendar year, but we haven't seen the regs yet. We don't know how the Department of Health is going to provide oversight over these different things. So there's a lot to be ironed out yet. But for those folks that are eager about edibles, the commission originally thought, here's the last part, is the commission originally thought they didn't need the legislature's approval to even do this. So it is kind of good that they were able to get it the first year they asked for it. It does show that the commission and the legislature are working hand in hand every day to get some of these things fixed for patients. So they're not great all the time, but a lot of times they are there in Annapolis fighting for patient and advocating rights. The last thing on here we'll kind of touch and move on to the next one was the regulating medical cannabis advertising. We haven't seen a lot of details of this either. I know that there were several bills that were very detailed and widespread, everything from banning billboards and
age gates on social media,
and not being able to advertise on a radio station unless their general population was above 43 years. You know, it was always like crazy, like
kind of arbitrary how you would measure those.
Yeah. So a lot of that, and then then we saw the commission like pass this recommendation, I guess. But once again, they're unable to enforce it. Yeah. The legislature didn't endorse it either. So we'll see some regulation on advertising, but nothing has been super ironed out as at this point.
I will just say the one thing in regards to the advertising for those of us that are in the industry, we can help ourselves out here. And that's kind of what the commission said, and what our lobbyists have said is that, you know, like, it's not a recreational program. And a lot of the stuff that we do as a dispensary, we try to keep it as professional and medical as possible. And Maryland's super good about it for the most part. A lot of the growers, processors, dispensaries try to do that. But it's that one or two things that people put out there that catches somebody's eye that drives all the regulation. So just a plea to our other participents in the industry just to keep it professional.
So we had one advertising issue here in Salisbury with us, and it wasn't even us. But because we were kind of seen as the cannabis player in Salisbury, when people saw medical marijuana yard signs start popping up on Route 50 and Route 13, it was a doctor that was doing recommendations. But they were just yard signs that said, try medical marijuana, and a phone number. Like, inappropriate to the point that I went through and picked some of them up and took them down because it was a bad look for us. And I believe in self-policing the industry, and the industry sure as heck made it so that they didn't want these yard signs popping up that make our industry look bad. I went and took them down. We had a certain industry player put Adam and Eve passing a joint on Route 50 right before all the politicians head down to the Tallest Crab and Clam Bake. They all drive by that billboard and they see it, and it caused an uproar, which is one of the catalysts for this advertising bill being started in the first place. So I'm glad Chuck brought something up because, I do believe that a lot of this stuff, if we self-police and self-regulate, because the politicians and legislators are so out of the loop, they leave us alone. It's not until they see an egregious sign or what they perceive to be egregious. I'm not even saying it was egregious, but it's not something that we would have done in the good taste of a medical program and trying to be a good steward in our community. So the advertising stuff, I think I hope it doesn't get as archaic as what was proposed by the commission, but I also understand that there needs to be some rules and boundaries set because apparently some of our good colleagues are a little unfamiliar with couth. Opioid use disorder. This bill added opioid use disorder to the list of qualifying conditions. It did ask and added language to limit the approval to patients. They said they had to try other traditional treatments and unsuccessful, and that they were going to use medical cannabis in conjunction with traditional therapies. So this is something that is near and dear to my heart as kind of being in the perfect age of the opioid epidemic. 1998, 2000 in Pasadena when all of a sudden people started stealing their parents' oxys, and then their parents cut them off and they started doing heroin. Then they started dying and having all kinds of negative repercussions. And a lot of really good friends and family members, some through accidents, some through sports injuries. A lot of folks have found themselves in this opioid dependency situation, and I am of the very utmost belief that medical cannabis has a huge role in this epidemic that we face right now. And I'm hoping that by adding this as a specific qualifying condition, even if it's just a PR or an acknowledgement thing, so that addiction facilities and doctors and physicians and nurses and these providers start recognizing that, hey, this isn't a drug for a drug, or if substitution therapy works with methadone, then maybe substitution therapy might work with medical cannabis. And I've personally put my money where my mouth is. I've gone to some of these rehab facilities and had the tough conversations, and will continue to do that because I've seen firsthand the amount of patients that have come in through our dispensary and either drastically reduced the amount of opiates that they're taking, or in many cases stopped taking opiates altogether and replaced it with cannabis, and also replace their quality of life, where they're not constipated, they're not stuck in the house, they don't have no energy. They see their kids, they're going to church, they're going to work, they're doing what they need to do, and cannabis has completely helped them go through a dependency and an addiction into a quality of life. So kudos to Senator Bobby Zirkin and Delegate Glenn for working together on this bill, and I hope that this is more proof that we're onto something here.
Yeah, I think I think by this point in time in 2019, everybody knows not only somebody but multiple people have been affected in some way by the opioid epidemic. And I mean, I'm not even gonna go into it in more in depth because I'm sure everybody hears it all day. It's all over the news. But I think cannabis is something, like Darby said, that we've seen it help so many people get off a lot of these. And it's not only opioids. I know Mary Pat, in one of her presentations, has a slide about some patients that have came to us. They were taking 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 pills a day for a lot of these things they're trying to cure. And 3 months into their medical cannabis program and their treatment, like, they're done.
Yeah, they're off.
They're done. The majority of the other medications. It doesn't alleviate everything. Some of them still have some stuff they have to take, but like the bad ones that mess up your liver and your kidneys and have these dependencies, like,
it's not just opioids.
To get off of them.
Things like Lyrica, the benzos, all these different
Ambien at night's not the best thing in the world.
Like here we have cannabis, one of the most amazing therapies for insomnia that's ever existed. And, people shove their nose and they give folks Ambien. I mean, my personal experience with Ambien was giving it to my father to sleep, and then him like sleepwalking at 4:00 in the morning, like awake but not asleep. And then it just seemed like it was brutal. So, I'm glad that the folks are continuing to recognize this. And I think that what this does, I guess what I wanted to get at was this doesn't mean all of a sudden now we're going to start treating opioid use disorder in our dispensaries, because we've been treating it now for
a while,
since the day we opened, mostly under the chronic pain or other issue. But now it's official, and now folks will actually be able to go to their doctor.
I don't think it's official yet.
Oh, it's not? I thought it said...
I think it said it's stalled.
Oh, I apologize. So it's not official yet.
But nonetheless, that puts it on, like, no matter what's official or not, like Darby said, like, we treat it all the time, and it's super, super effective treatment for that stuff. And, it's going to get done, I think, something like that. There's too much good that can come out of it.
Another one that I think will have some legs but was not successful now was worker protections. We gave a presentation to the Chamber of Commerce and just discussed like productivity and hiring practices and what firms can do to make sure that they're not missing out on highly performing cannabis candidates. In New York, we saw a bill just pass. That did pass, I believe, in New York City. Matter of fact, that was tied into an article, Chuck, where they were talking, and the headline was, like, postgraduates no longer stress about finding the job at the top firm. Morgan Stanley, Citibank, and 2 other firms no longer test for marijuana, and one of them no longer tests for any drugs at all.
Wow.
And
microdose revolution.
Microdose revolution in the finance world. They say, you bring that ketamine to work, kid, as long as you can work all night long. But we saw cases in Massachusetts where worker rights were protected. When you probably didn't recognize this, but one of the people that came up to us when we had our 420 celebration that was talking to me was a nurse who actually lost her job for testing positive for cannabis. And there were no protections at her particular nursing home for her. And, when you get the reality of these situations, she just didn't want to lose her accreditation. Right, so although she lost her job, she was just happy that her job didn't report her, so she didn't lose her accreditation. We talked to her. She's actually now got 2 patients she's caregiving for, which is really cool, and found another job. But we know firsthand folks that have lost their jobs. And what I think about more the intangible is how many people don't apply for jobs that they're really qualified for to begin with because they know that they drug test or because of their drug policy. When I was in finance, sales and stuff, there was a lot of things that I was just like, nah, not today. It's not worth it. It's 30 days of misery to apply for that. I don't think so.
And I will attest to this firsthand, because for those of you who don't know, especially in doing large scale commercial construction this day and age, like, you're drug tested so frequently, and you hop around from job to job to job, and every time you go somewhere else, you have to take drug tests. And like a lot of the guys, I mean, it's no different than any other demographic. A large majority of people use cannabis, and people run around scared because they're gonna fail these drug tests and get fired. Like, it's kind of crazy. I mean, you can go home and take your medical cannabis and still test dirty for a couple days afterwards. I mean, you wake up, you wake up, you go in the morning, you have no side effects. You go into work, and there's an accident or something and you test positive, like, that's it. And I don't think that that's fair, especially in the construction industry. I mean, you beat your body up. You get up in the middle of the night, you beat your body up all day long. And a lot of guys go home, and their compensation for that is to drink a bucket of beer, take all these pain pills, and then they come in to work the next day. And I saw it all the time. And they're just not there in the head. Then you had the guys who go home, smoke a little bit of cannabis before they go to bed. They're the top performing people on the job. There every day. It's crazy. And I hope that more and more employers follow suit and kind of realize that the whole cannabis thing isn't what it seems.
No, I mean, it sends a message. I mean, if I'm an employer and I hurt my back on site and you say, well, you can't use cannabis, then what do you think the doctor's going to recommend me?
Yep.
prescribe a Percocet or an Oxy or a muscle relaxer, something that's likely going to impact my performance. Just on the another, I don't want to go too long on this, but Mary Pat knew of a gal who got a job in a marketing firm making like $100,000 a year. And week 2 of her getting her job, her Crohn's starts flaring up, like in a way that like she can't go to work. And she ended up missing like 2 months of work for a Crohn's flare up because for the first time she couldn't use cannabis out of fear they were going to drug test her and she was going to lose her job. Instead of letting her use cannabis and come to work on freaking Wednesday.
Yeah.
Like, so instead that company basically had an employee out for months. The employee was in pain all over this like weird, chaotic drug testing policy. Like, we just, it's odd to me, and it's so cool for us at the dispensary. Yeah. That's one of my favorite things in the world is sending my potential employees and applicants in for a drug test, knowing 100% well if they're a patient of ours that they're gonna fail for cannabis, and knowing that I don't judge them in any way, shape, or like you're not judged here for that. How many times did you have to feel bad or have to stop taking your medicine to go? I'm not willing to lay it out here, but I've gone through some outrageous means to pass drug tests for employers, and it's fucking disgusting. There's my first F-bomb. It is. It truly is. And I'd like to see a day where cannabis patients don't need to feel ostracized or like that there's some kind of criminal through passing an arbitrary drug test. And the fact that it stays in your system for so long, like Chuck pointed out, it's crazy that someone could go on a vacation and recreationally use cannabis in Vegas, in a legal state on a weekend, and then 3 weeks later get rear-ended and have no impact from cannabis at all, but have a metabolite in their system that comes out in a P test, and now they lose their job, and the guy who rear-ended them is walks away fine. So, all right. So lawmakers, although that didn't get through, we would really like to see that, and I think privately you're going to see more and more businesses start to do it on their own. All right, last 2 things, and we're going to wrap this up. Taxation of medical cannabis businesses. We're going to keep this short so that we don't cuss a lot.
I don't think that's possible, no matter how short we keep it.
So for those folks that don't understand, there's the John Gotti rule. IRS 280E basically says that any business that does anything that's federally illegal but takes revenue or income from those illegal activities is not treated like a regular business, but still must pay taxes. It must pay taxes on everything minus what you paid for whatever it is you sold.
Your cost of goods sold.
Cost of goods sold. So our employee salaries, improvements to the building, IT infrastructure,
marketing framework, like anything you can think of that is not the cost of our product.
If you own a business and you're listening to this podcast and you just said, "What about whatever you just said?" No, doesn't matter. But nope, doesn't matter. That's the only good thing about this process is it's one of the easiest. I just thought about this. We pay our accountants a lot of money for a pretty easy equation.
It's 2 checkboxes.
It's a fairly easy equation.
No.
But yeah. So and what now you're seeing is it wasn't something that was talked about when there was 3 states and there was only 200 operators. But now you have multinational companies and national companies. You have 33 states now with programs, and it's becoming more of a situation. Until they fix this, the 2 major challenges for any state legal entity that's federally legal is your IRS and then really banking. So you're seeing some bills start pop up to address these needs. It didn't get through. I gotta admit that I think the only reason why a bill like this doesn't get through is just because of apathy of hearing so much cannabis legislation. They got killed with the dispensary location bill. They got killed on the edible bill. All their time was spent on that. It doesn't seem like this is something that people would be staunchly opposed to.
I think and like this, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we do in this industry that's really hard to grasp for a lot of people if you're not really in it every day. And something like this, when you try to explain how it affects a business, is one of those things that people really just can't grasp. So, simple example, if our company did $1 million in sales and we paid $500,000 $500,000, that was our cost for the product that we sold, we would have a tax bill of $500,000. So what that doesn't include is all the expenses that we paid in salaries, in payroll taxes, in rent, in security costs, keep the lights on, electricity, power, Comcast, marketing, anything you can think of, all our IT infrastructure.
We want to, and we've done everything right. So we don't pay our employees minimum wage. We don't skirt by the minimum here. We bought and make expenditures significantly in security and things like that, and then it's all for nothing.
I mean, so basically at the end of the day, you have to end up paying taxes on $500,000 instead of, say, $200,000, and that's a huge difference. And what I try to tell people, especially the politicians, is like, our business, like, we're trying to grow the business. We're not trying to take this money out of the business. If I have to pay the government everything that we make, unfortunately, I can't hire more people, which is something I really want to do. I can't do capital improvements to the building because it's something that I really want to do. I can't keep on doing community outreach, even though it's something I really want to do. We just don't have the money for it because apparently the IRS is better at allocating our money than we are. And I think that was my little, for the day. But as
very well reserved, Mr. Chuck. I'm very proud of you.
I tried. I was as good as I can do. But I think that we're seeing some movement here, especially at the federal level. The States Act, I think, will fix some of this to a certain degree. That's essentially more or less a banking act. We're fortunate enough to now have a banking partner. We didn't for the first year, but these little things, like, it's night and day what we're able to do when we get some of these services that traditional businesses have. And I think that as the industry evolves, certainly the patients are going to start to see that.
When people think banking, they say, oh, you can't have a bank account. Well, no, we can have a bank account, but we can't use Shopify. We can't use online platforms.
We don't have a credit card.
We can't use credit cards. We can't. And that's not just for cannabis. That's for our hemp business oftentimes, too. We just were served a notice last week. Our merchant service account is in jeopardy again after I spent damn near 2 months to get it set up in the first place. And those guys that know my background through I trickled through we work with a payment processing company. It's my background. I have tons of assets and resources here, but because the Farm Bill has cleared some things up, but not cleared up the FDA stance and other positions on hemp, we still struggle with banking that business. So there's a lot of progress that could be made on the federal side of this in terms of the taxation and like research and development. I wonder how many of these large multi-million-dollar companies would dedicate an extra $1 million to research and development if it didn't have to go right to IRS 288. I mean, Chuck said, we're not trying to take the money out of the business even. We would love to just reinvest the money, but the money, if we got to pay the money can only go one place, and you got to pay the IRS. So once that's done, we don't pay ourselves, nor do we make the investments in the business. I mean, so it's an important bill. I'd like to see some traction. I think at a federal level, it's really more important in terms of its impact to us at a state level, but it would be great if we could see that. The very last thing that we're going to end on is kind of this discussion around what the legalization of cannabis. It's going through a couple different names. So it used to be rec use, and then that sounded too irresponsible. So then it was adult use, and then they're not users, they're consumers. So now I believe the PC term for now is adult consumption market. Full legalization of cannabis where you can go and purchase it at any type of regulated entity. I've gone all over on this. First, I was completely for it. Then I actually favored just well-regulated medical states with high levels of access. And then I was really introduced to a lot of the purview and legal ramifications that come with legalizing cannabis. And it's funny. Most people's lives are not affected. Even cannabis users' lives are not affected by cannabis being illegal at this point. Even if you're not a patient, but those that are seem like they're grossly impacted. It seems like a lot of times these laws are used in conjunction with other instances that have exponential impacts on folks. The idea of maybe they got in trouble once, they got pulled over, and now they have a little bit of weed on them. That's now used to get them back into the system, and things get complicated. And the truth is, the catalyst to them getting back into the system was something as simple as maybe having 11 grams of weed on you instead of 10. Which is such an arbitrary number. So I am now for the legalization of cannabis in Maryland under a regulated environment. And I think what you're going to see, we follow this really often. So cannabis is certainly a social issue more than anything else when you talk about the legalization of it, and it follows other social issues. One that it follows very closely, in Maryland at least, is gay marriage. So when you look at gay marriage approval ratings, endorsement levels, and kind of the path of legalization of gay marriage, it's not anything that the legislators really wanted to address direct or head on. No one really wanted to check a box and take a chance of alienating any constituents one way or the other. It's such a divisive topic. They just said, you know what, we'll leave it up to the public to vote on. And oftentimes like that, the public makes a rational decision, and overwhelmingly gay marriage becomes legal in the state of Maryland. I think Canada, and we saw casinos and gambling follow a similar suit. I think that you're going to see cannabis, legalization of cannabis follow the exact same suit. I think you're going to see it on the 2020 referendum. Charles?
No, I agree. I think it'll be, so what they did, just legally now, they have a working group that they formed. So out of all of this, they actually formed a working group, which from what I understand, talking to people, is like the first step to get something on a ballot. Once the working group gets together, they're going to convene. They're going to meet at the end of this year, I believe, with the findings. So they want to know how much revenue it's going to generate. They want to know what the effective tax rate is going to be, and a bunch of other different things. But I think, like Darby said, it's going to go to the ballot, and I think you'll see an overwhelming pass in the state once it actually gets to the ballot. And like Darby said, I'm on board with it too. I mean, I don't see, just for economic reasons, right? There's a ton of economic upside to having an entire industry come into a state, and especially a lot of these areas, more rural areas like the Eastern Shore that are based on agriculture. I mean, cannabis is industrial hemp's going to be an agricultural commodity, just like corn, wheat, soybeans, anything like that. Cannabis is a little more niche, but it's still an agricultural product. And I mean, these communities that are looking for this influx, looking for something new, looking for people to stay there, looking for an employment base, like this industry is going to provide such opportunity for that, I think. And I think it's going to be really cool to see.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Two things. One is just an economic driver in general. You look at a place like Calta in Cambridge. I think he's got 60-something employees now. They're getting health benefits. It's an economic driver to a place that has lost a lot of industry over the last 20 or 30 years. My big prediction that I've been kind of stumping around, I saw it's becoming less and less of a kind of a wild card, because I just saw this weekend a Baltimore City mayoral candidate is proposing basically Baltimore City legalize and tax cannabis to fund pre-K. And that's what I think is going to happen. So I mentioned in the early part of the podcast, a lot of the legislators were occupied with the findings of the Kerwin Commission and basically finding the revenue to implement all these suggestions. Universal pre-K is one of the suggestions. I think the number's somewhere between $4 and $10 billion. I know it's a big number, but I think I've heard, honestly, projections somewhere in between all those different numbers. And the working group for Kerwin is there. So you got a working group for Kerwin, and now you got a working group for recreational cannabis. And my assumption is they're going to talk to each other, because here's something that a lot of people don't know. The state doesn't make money off our medical program. There's no tax. So besides the fees that we pay, the fines that they assess, the fees that patients pay for card and application process, that's really the only money that Maryland gets. And I don't know if they operate at a loss or not, but it's part of the Department of Health's budget, and it's not this cash cow because Maryland doesn't allow for you to tax medicine. It's a law.
Yeah, it's a self-supporting. The MMCC basically is a self-supporting.
So if you went with this idea of a rec program, your medical program is not going away. Your medical program is staying in place because you're not going to tax people that are trying to get their medicine. So you get a medical program that stays in place, so no tax comes to those folks. And then you do a sweep of having a recreational program or adult consumption program. And then I would suggest that you would look at a significantly substantial tax rate on that program, and then those funds generated could be part of this lockbox that Maryland's going to create and could be put into funding universal pre-K, which I think you've seen essences of in Colorado and some other states and counties, municipalities have looked at making some funding of education around this. To me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, you've gotten beat up by Virginia, not so much Virginia, but Delaware, has beaten you up, in New Jersey have beaten you up in casino revenues for years of being ahead of the game. And now you'd have a chance to beat Delaware, to beat New Jersey, to beat Pennsylvania,
Virginia, West
Virginia. West Virginia. I mean, and if you're looking at the Route 95 corridor, you're coming up, you're the very first one south to north. I think you really put Maryland in a great opportunity to fix a school system that I mean. So the other thing that I heard about was, Maryland's facing, as always, a huge budget deficit going into next year. I mean, you have continued bills being passed with guaranteed money being allotted to these programs, and there's not enough money in the budget. Just because you write it in law and say that it must get that funding, if the funding's not there, it doesn't happen. So I think this is a really great way. With the opioid epidemic increasing, this could be a way that you battling that, you're increasing funds, education, and it could really be a great benefit and boon to the community, and really change kind of the perception that cannabis is this horrible drug that spoils communities and ruins towns, and
it's going to be the opposite. It's going to bring them all together.
Right? Yeah, this is not your brain on drug anymore. I mean, this is the opposite of that. And I don't know. It seems like a no-brainer. But then even getting something passed as simple as IRS legislation, it's tough. So we'll see. I don't think at a federal level, it's weird. Like the caveat and last thing, the federal side of things, I don't see the federal government having the wherewithal to pass anything at a federal level before Maryland does. I just don't think it'll happen. But then sometimes
you just never know.
You see that the former Speaker of the House is now on the board of a company that's making the largest merger in the cannabis space under the contingency of federal legalization. Well,
yeah. I mean that I'm glad you mentioned that, because when you see that line, like it's a $3.4 billion. I think it's a $3.4 billion merger, right, between Canopy Growth, who's one of Canada's largest companies, and Acreage Holding, which is one of the United States' largest holdings. And the whole deal, they even put the price in place, $3.4 billion, contingent upon federal legalization in the U.S. I don't think either one of us see a way that deal gets done and goes public and hits the news wire unless there's not something going on somewhere.
Man, when you're John Boehner, former Speaker of the House, you got a lot of whiskey to drink and cigars to smoke in Kentucky. You don't need to be out hammering cannabis deals, and unless two things. I mean, you're motivated, or B, you think you can get it done. I think you got to feel both of them. And I think when you get a conservative like John Boehner, he goes, "Oh, yeah, I changed my mind about cannabis." It almost makes it okay for a ton of following suit guys that say, "Well, he said it's okay now."
It's a precedent, man. He set that precedent.
So, I think 3 to 5 years is the window that we always talk about for full legalization at a federal or at least a full state level. What that looks like, we'll see. For us, it's the most important thing, and Chuck and I will agree on this, and this will be the last thing we say. As cool as it is to think about recreation, adult use, and all of that, for us, it's more about continuing and building out these medical programs, continuing the research and development. There's so much anecdotal information coming to light that until we get the freedom to do good research, until we get the ability and dollars to be able to do clinical trials on this stuff,
reinvest in our companies,
we're always going to be a leg behind modern medicine. And I think that federal legalization of at this stage that we can go work with a bank and that we can go get a university research grant and that we're able to move like a traditional business, that's what's most important. And that's really what's going to take cannabis from where it's still at in its toddler stage right now. It's not an infant any longer for sure, but it's definitely not mature. I mean, there's still
years and years
and
away.
years and years ahead to go. So we will see. So that's our first one. So I hope you guys enjoyed getting some insight into what the Maryland cannabis bills look like this month. That was probably one of the more drier topics that we'll get into, to be honest with you. We'll try to get into some funner ones, but I definitely wanted to give you guys insight into what we see and what we think when we see these bills getting published on the front of the Baltimore Sun with a headline and a 10-word article. So Anthony, Darby signing off. Chuck Henn, any last words?
No. We'll see you guys back next week.
Podcast number 1 in the books. Take care.